Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Literature Lovers Night Out. Thank you for joining us for what is sure to be a fascinating conversation tonight with our special guests, author Mary Casanova and Kate Moore. If you're joining us this evening from various parts of the country, please let us know in the chat box what town or state or country you are tuning in from. We'd love to see where all of our audience is coming from to hear these fine authors this evening. I'm Pamela Klinger-Horn, and on behalf of Valley Bookseller in beautiful Stillwater, Minnesota, and Excelsior Bay Books in beautiful Lakeside, Excelsior, Minnesota, I'd like to welcome you to the program. We're excited to have you, and we're having a rather damp evening in Minnesota, so I'm hoping that we are providing you with some entertainment since you can't be outside doing your regular boating and swimming summer activities. Oh, we've got people tuning in from Shoreview, Minnesota, and Connecticut. Great. We love to see those out-of-state people. So we're expecting a nice sized crowd tonight. And if you can't watch all the program or if you miss it this evening, it will be recorded and you will receive a link by email tonight with the recording for YouTube, which will be available tomorrow, as well as the links from both bookstores to order your books with one-click shopping. You are also always welcome, of course, to visit the bookstores in person. They both open at 10 o'clock tomorrow, or you can call by phone, but the online links will be provided for you this evening. So lots of people from different areas of Minnesota tonight. Thank you all for joining us. And of course, our biggest thank you to Mary Casanova, who's joining us from northern Minnesota, and Kate Moore, who's joining us from Great Britain, where it is 1 o'clock in the morning. Luckily for us, she said she's a night owl. So thank you so much again, ladies. I appreciate it. They are going to be in conversation tonight about their historical works about women's rights and mental health. When I read these books, I was absolutely fascinated and thought that this would be a conversation that I would like to listen to. And I hope in turn that you will also be interested in this conversation. Mary Casanova's latest novel is called Waterfall from the University of Minnesota Press, right here in our home state. And Kate Moore has recently published The Woman They Could Not Silence from Source Books, who also published her earlier work, Radium Girls, with which I'm sure many of you are familiar. So one is a novel and one is nonfiction. So I thought that would be a really fun way to explore this topic tonight. During the program, I'm going to put direct links in the chat box for both Valley Bookseller and Excelsior Bay Books. So you can copy and paste those into your browser after the program and do your shopping very easily. And if you have any questions, please feel free to enter those in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to those later in the program. Now, without further ado, let's get started. After I read Waterfall and then the nonfiction book, The Woman They Could Not Silence, I couldn't wait to discuss more about this topic, that there were laws that actually enabled husbands and families to lock their wives, their mothers, their daughters up in mental institutions because they were perhaps too outspoken, inconvenient, or promiscuous. This is appalling, and yet it's still so relevant today. And I think that we are going to be hearing a really, really interesting conversation about this topic tonight. And I thank both Kate and Mary for being willing to discuss this with us. Many of you will know Mary Casanova as the award-winning author of 39 novels. She is one of our Minnesota literary treasures. Waterfall is her third novel of historical fiction set in northern Minnesota up near Rainy Lake. As I said, it's published by the prestigious University of Minnesota Press, and she is going to give us an overview of Waterfall and a brief reading this evening. So Kate and I will pop off screen and let Mary take it away. Let's give her a big round of virtual applause.
Thank you,
Mary.
thank you. Well, I'm so excited to be able to talk with interested book people tonight, book lovers. Because this book is so close to my heart. Waterfall is a book that I probably have been carrying around to one degree or another for about 25 years. And I first came across it, I I was going to an island with a group of writers, and if for those who are in Minnesota, there's a renowned environmentalist who ran an island called Mallard Island. And it was on that island in his study that I saw this picture of a young woman who was standing on the end of some kind of a makeshift diving platform. It was a black and white photo. It's now used on the cover of this book, but she looked athletic and she looked confident. She was wearing fashionable swimwear of the 20s. And I just wondered who it was. Who was this young woman? She was in the back of my mind as I started writing one novel called Frozen and another called Ice Out, both set in 1920, 1922 in northern Minnesota, and historical fiction. I didn't intend to write about this character. Her name is Trinity Baird in my story, but she demanded to have a story all her own. And I would like to share some images that give you some idea of some of the background and that you can see actually. So bear with me as I try to share a screen with you, and I'm looking for it right now and not seeing it, of course, so that isn't a good start. But let's see if I can find it. Here we go. I think that is what I want. I'm going to start right here. I might jump around a little bit. The first book I wrote was for young adults because marketing thought it should be for young adults and my editor thought it should be for adults. So these three books are all really crossovers between YA and adult readers. But Frozen was about a young prostitute found frozen in the snow and how somebody stood her body up as a joke at the start of a town hall meeting up in the county that I live in called Koochiching County. It haunted me, and I found a way to tell her story through the eyes of a supposed daughter who had followed her out into the snowstorm.
Mary, I'm sorry to interrupt you.
Yes.
The screen share is not working.
It's not working? Okay,
Nope.
well, we won't screen share because then I won't be, hold on, let me see if I can figure out how to not do screen share. And we will, let's see.
Unless you want to try screen share again at the bottom of the screen there. Like
yes.
Earlier, so we know you can do it.
Let's just try it and see. Share screen. Maybe we can do it. Let's try this. Share. What do you get now?
Yeah, I can see the slide with the side. There you go. Now you've got the full screen. It's working correctly. Thank you. Perfect.
All right. So the first book that I did was about a 16-year-old girl, daughter of a prostitute. It immersed me into 1920s history. And right away with issues of women during that time, I was running into also issues of how were women treated. And in this case, it was a prostitute whose frozen body was stood up as a joke at the beginning of a town hall meeting. And it was appalling to hear that somebody might think something like that could be funny, and led to writing a story that I think of as a very strong female character who literally loses her voice and has to find it. The second book that I wrote is a young man's story, but it's also prohibition, and it's this era of what was happening at that time. Again, the backdrop is just like weaving all kinds of history in to try to get at the truth of that time period. But Waterfall is the one that seemed really close to my heart when I realized that here was this young woman, very independent, who actually could have been a woman who, could have been very much on her own 2 feet in our society today. But back then, she came from a wealthy family, and just because you come from wealth doesn't mean that you are secured your independence. And so in my story, the story starts in Waterfall, where Trinity has been sent away for nearly 2 years to an asylum and returns to her family's island. And her great struggle really is how does she find a way back to wholeness after having her whole life shattered by the people around her that she thought were there for her, and instead really have all the power over her destiny. So it's a summer story of her hanging on to her sanity and finding a way to be her own person despite those limitations. Let me see if I can show you a few other images. Those of you who are from Minnesota, I live up on the Minnesota-Canadian border. So this little bridge connects Minnesota with Canada and is divided by a very big lake called Rainy Lake. We lived in a house near there for many, many years where we raised our kids. Here's that same bay 100 years ago, and you can see women with parasols. And corsets as people were taking steamships to go further up the lake, 100-mile lake. Of course, it was a time of great change. The very true natives of the area, locals of the area, the Native American Ojibwe people were still trading with birch bark canoes with some of the newly transplanted locals from outside of the area. It was a time when the women were just getting the right to vote. So 1920 was finally the women getting the right to vote, but even that was not an easy struggle. Women were jailed, beaten for protesting for the simple right to vote. It was prohibition, of course, which complicated things. And this is a picture of a federal agent in our area that was, they had confiscated some booze on a train that was coming through from Canada into the US. And they were making a big photo op moment of this. Well, what the history book said was that the locals showed up with cups and buckets for like the first snow cones, I'd like to say, of whiskey and ice. It was a time when they had people taking sleighs out in the winter and a lot of gambling and 1-mile horse races on this vast lake. A hotel called Kettle Falls that weaves into my stories that was ripe for a lot of illicit activity, prostitution, bootlegging, and it's still on the historic register today. And it's part of Voyageurs National Park. So it's also a place that people can visit today and step back in time. The character that I was inspired by really is inspired by a real person named Virginia Roberts, who did have a family that was very wealthy. And she had a yacht named after her, a 50-foot yacht. And it always amazed me, like, why would you name the yacht after one daughter when there were 3 daughters and a mother? And I needed to explore that in my story. I'm going to jump ahead. I weave in this environmentalist, Ernest Oberholzer. Here's that original photo that I saw on his island. And then Atsakan Island, I call Barrett Island in my story. And it is, this yacht has come back to that island where it originally was purchased, and somebody has restored it. The owner, Jim Hansen, has brought it back to Rainy Lake, where I also meet every summer for a week with a group of writers. In fact, last week I was meeting with some teen writers at this island, and it was so fun to take this writing workshop concept to teens and start to develop and empower these younger women through their writing and on this island that has inspired me. This is a picture of the writers group that I meet with, many Minnesota authors here that people would know if they look closely, and my dear friends. Just a little bit of the atmosphere of that island. This whole story takes place on this island, and it is all built up in the early 1900s. Virginia Roberts, the actual inspiration, was an artist. She had her own artist cabin, and so this is her studio cabin. And in real life, this was her cabin. It's also on the cover of a book called Cabins of Minnesota. So she had her own space to be an artist. Here's a little idea of the vintage, the period piece, and all these fancy swimsuits, swimwear from that era. And Virginia would be the one who is second from the left. And Ernest Oberholzer is the third from the right. He canoed up to Hudson Bay and did a lot of exploring. They're all characters. I find a way to really weave in the family of the story, or the stories of the family. Sinclair Lewis spent time on one of the wealthy owners' islands up in this area, as well as a princess from Spain. And I weave that into my story as well. So why fictionalize? You know, I ended up not going with Virginia Roberts because though I think she was an inspiration to my story, she isn't a history maker. And I was really wanting to dig into the lack of women's control over their own lives at that time. And so she inspires it. And then I allow myself to take this young woman who is an artist. Here's a photo of her mother. You can see you read into that as you will, but you will get to know her in my story should you read Waterfall. And I decided that she's the type of independent young woman who could easily have been sent away because of not conforming to all the norms. And here's a picture of the State Hospital for the Insane in St. Peter, Minnesota. It was run very much as a big bucolic kind of farm. In some ways, you can see in this picture, the sheep are out front, but it was a self-sustaining community. And so everything was grown there that the inmates or the patients would need to consume and to wear. Let's see what else can I tell you about it. I went there to do research and was really thankful that they have a museum there that you can visit in St. Peter that it really gives you an idea of what the conditions might have been like. Early 19th century, just a quick list of some of the things that you might be able to be considered insane based on some of these little things like death of a husband, death of a wife, death of a child, poverty, remorse, opium habit. I mean, spiritualism, all kinds of stuff, nymphomania, masturbation, epilepsy. So it gives you a quick overview of how crazy and how broad the category was of insanity. So who decides? I mean, that was just a really kind of a crazy time. So with Waterfall, I'm going to read a little bit of the scene where my character is looking back at when she first enters the asylum. And I think that would be a good transition maybe to Kate Moore's book, who I have to say, Kate just really captures a real person in history with so much drama. It's a thriller, can't put it down. And I just loved the depth of her nonfiction research that I felt dovetailed so well with my story, Waterfall, and a woman trying to maintain her sanity and her independence. So here we go. She had never known much about chickens before Oak Hills, which was a giant farm and village unto itself. No matter your background, everyone worked to keep things operating. She'd worked at the poultry barn, gathering eggs and cleaning nesting boxes. In the kitchen, she had diced onions until her tears flowed. In the sewing room, she learned to stitch patient gowns. And in the admissions office, she wrote out the doctor's diagnosis in shorthand. She flashed back to her first day, almost 2 years ago, when she was admitted. "Undress, please," the nurse had said, not unkindly, in the room covered in white ceramic tiles. "Undress? Right here?" "It's standard admitting procedure," the nurse replied. Piece by piece, Trinity undressed down to her chemise, then stopped. Surely they didn't expect her to drop every stitch to the tiled floor. She asked with her eyes, and the nurse nodded. Never had she felt so powerless. With goosebumps rising, she was told to leave her clothes in the pile and step into the next room where a hot bath waited. The room smelled of disinfectant and the clawfoot tub steamed. She climbed in, uncomfortably aware that her bum was exposed to the world before she sank into the warm water as 2 nurses began to scrub her from scalp to toes. "Honestly, I can scrub myself." Trinity pushed their hands away. "You might be the Queen of Sheba, but it doesn't change our policy. Some patients come in crawling with lice, and we can't let that start spreading." "Well, I'm not one of them," Trinity insisted. "This must all be a mistake." "That's for us to determine," the second nurse said, resuming her scrubbing, but harder this time. And so Trinity had entered the asylum squeaky clean, wearing a squarish blue patient gown, coarse as burlap, with her sense of self swirled down the drain. After that first thorough scrubbing, showers and bathing became infrequent. Her dirty hair often clung to her head. And that's probably a good spot for me to stop as an introduction to Waterfall, and I would love to turn it over to Kate.
Mary, thank you so much. That was fascinating. And I love the slideshow. It gives you a real insight into the time period and the characters. So you can turn off the screen share now if you would. Thank you so much. And we are going to now introduce Kate Moore. Kate Moore burst onto the literary scene back in 2017 with The Radium Girls. I'm sure many of you have read her wonderful book, as it was well known and a New York Times and USA Today bestseller. It was also 2017 Goodreads Choice Award for Best History and was voted US Librarian's favorite in 2017. Radium Girls is also published in a YA edition. So if you have younger readers in your home, they will enjoy reading it. I have read both and I can highly recommend them. I love seeing the photographs of the real characters and getting to know these girls on a more personal level. And Kate really does an excellent job of making sure that you know that these are real women who endured these experiences. And as of 2021, she is back with The Woman They Could Not Silence. as Mary said, it reads like a thriller despite being nonfiction. It is just incredible. Elizabeth Packard is her main character, and she is a hero of epic proportions and should be a household name. I certainly hope now that the book is out and that Kate will be talking about it, that people will read it and that she will gain her place in history that she deserves. So please welcome Kate Moore and Elizabeth Packard to our virtual stage. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pamela. Thank you to Valley Bookseller and Excelsior Bay Books, and of course to Mary Casanova for coming tonight as well. I can't wait for our conversation, which is going to happen shortly. Before that, I get to introduce you to my new book and to its heroine. This is The Woman They Could Not Silence. So as Pamela explained, the woman at the heart of my book is a woman called Elizabeth Packard, but I suspect that many of you have never heard her name before, because as often happens to feisty women who stand up for themselves, her name has been forgotten by history, and we remember instead the men who tried but failed to silence her. I'm so excited to be talking about this book now and for this book to be out in the world, because it is a non-fiction book and a true story that has everything. A compelling heroine, enraging fight against injustice, injustice that still resonates today, courtroom drama, dastardly villains, and perhaps my personal favourite, a twist of gothic horror as I take you inside the insane asylums of the 19th century. So Elizabeth's story starts on the cusp of the American Civil War in June 1860. That chart that Mary showed you earlier listing causes of insanity in the 19th century, this is exactly the heart of the time about which I write in this book. And Elizabeth's story starts with Elizabeth, who was a 43-year-old housewife at the start of the book, a housewife and mother of 6, lying in bed in her marital home. And it starts with a simple question. What would happen if your husband could commit you to an insane asylum just because you disagreed with him? That's what happens to Elizabeth, a woman who simply but strongly believes, I, though a woman, have just as good a right to my opinion as my husband has to his. But Elizabeth lives in a time where women are regularly committed for acts of self-assertion, even for simply reading novels. She lives in a time where the received medical wisdom of the age says that simply being a woman leaves you at increased risk of going mad, so that a standard treatment of the era is surgical removal of the clitoris. Above all, Elizabeth lives in a time where husbands could send their wives away simply by request, and specifically without the evidence of insanity required in other cases. She lives in a time where a law known as coverture holds sway. It left married women with no civic rights at all, no rights to their own earnings, to the custody of their children, even to their very liberty. So Elizabeth is sent away to an asylum where, like Mary's character, Trinity, she finds herself surrounded by other sane women who have been dispatched to the asylum simply for being troublesome. And the book then charts how Elizabeth responds, because like Trinity, she is a woman who is determined to remain true to herself. And perhaps one of my favorite things about the book is the journey that Elizabeth goes on as she moves from housewife to historically significant heroine. It's the journey of a woman finding that unsilenceable voice as she moves from housewife to historically significant heroine, someone who successfully battles to improve the rights of women and the mentally ill. But make no mistake, though this is a history book, the issues at its heart could not be more modern. And that's actually how I came to Elizabeth Packard's story. The story started for me not on the cusp of the American Civil War in June 1860. It started in the fall of 2017, amid the fire of the Me Too movement. Everywhere that fall, women were speaking up and speaking out. But what really struck me was that finally, We were being listened to and believed. And it got me thinking, why hasn't that happened before? And how have women been controlled and undermined? All my thoughts around these issues coalesced around a single realization. For centuries, whenever women have used our voices, we've been called crazy. And that still happens right up to the present day. Vice President Kamala Harris, in the summer, she announced that she would run as Biden's running mate. She was actually called a mad woman. Look at Hillary Clinton running for president. She was called hysteric. Look at Britney Spears just the other week, a supposedly crazy woman fighting to get out from under the shackles of male authority. And so these were the issues I wanted to write about in my book. But as people may know from the Radium Girls, I think my strength as a writer, even though I'm a history writer, is to be a storyteller. So what I wanted to find was one woman's story in history, through whose story I could explore these issues, but in a way that I don't lose sight of the narrative and the heroine at its heart. I fell down a rabbit warren of internet searches hunting for her. And on the 15th of January, 2018, I first read the name Elizabeth Packard in a random University of Wisconsin essay that I found online. And the moment I started digging into her story, I realized she was the woman I wanted to write about next. Because what a woman she is, absolutely fearless. She defies the patriarchy. She defies the doctors of her age. She defies her husband. And she does it all with resilience and strength and an inner fortitude that I think we can all admire. My research took me through Elizabeth's own works as she became a writer, yet it also took me through the asylum's records, where I found, for example, a bit like the sewing room that Mary described in the piece she read, I found that when Elizabeth went to the sewing room, she wasn't only making patients' gowns, the women were making their own restraining jackets. And as I've linked to Mary there, and I can see it's about 7:30, I'm going to stop at this juncture. I hope that this gives you a short intro into the book. And I'd like to seek into the conversation with Mary now, because there are so many parallels, I think, both in our research journeys and in our characters and in our stories, even though they're actually set 60 years apart.
Thank you, Kate. I agree. It is absolutely fascinating. Had I run across that, I also would have been running through rabbit holes trying to find out more. You luckily are a talented writer and can bring the story to all of us. And so I know we're now in for a treat listening to your conversation with Mary. Audience members, if you have any questions for either author, please enter them in the Q&A and we'll get to those at the end of the program. But right now, I'm going to let Mary and Kate continue this conversation. Thank you.
After listening to you, Kate, and just such a wonderful summary of your story, which I heartily recommend to everybody to read, I'm really surprised that you did not go into your research already knowing about Elizabeth Packard, because she does seem like a character that, not a character, a historical figure that we should all know about. And you really make that clear on the pages of the book. But no, she wasn't known. And then it makes me beg the question, and this is something that I think about as a writer. There's 1,000 things one can write about, but I'm always trying to listen to what is the story that is coming to me that needs to be told, that isn't told. And I feel like so much of my journey as a writer is listening for that story and waiting for it to come. And do you feel some serendipity when it happens and you find somebody like Elizabeth Packard just through a little essay online?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of serendipity involved in it. And I think listening is a really valid and a lovely way of describing it, actually, because as you say, different ideas might cross your path or cross your brain, 100 times a day. But it's about knowing when you sort of feel it, whether it's in your head, your heart, your belly. For me, I know when there's something that I feel passionate about. And I think, I want to delve deeper into this story. I want to get up at 1 a.m. and talk about it. When you connect with that story and that character, that historical figure, there is something special about it. And you do then go on a journey, because as a writer, you obviously have to immerse yourself in that world, whether it's a non-fiction world like I write about, or whether it's the fictional world you're creating. And you live and breathe with that character, and you go on that journey with her. So I think it is about listening to find the connection, between you and the character. And I was absolutely blown away by your novel. I thought it was absolutely wonderful. And I was so struck by the similarities between our characters. And one thing that really struck me about both Trinity and Elizabeth is that when they were in the asylums, because a lot of your imagery is about water, of course, you talk about the way Trinity didn't want to feel pulled under by her emotions. Now, Elizabeth herself, because I was able to draw on Elizabeth's own writings, she writes about being locked inside a fortress of self-composure. And I just thought it was really interesting that we both, through fiction and non-fiction, found these women who, in order to remain sane within the asylums, had to almost self-censor themselves and their emotions.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that became so apparent reading your story too, that just acting a little too assertive in your opinion could be enough to deem you insane if you were trying to prove that you were sane. I mean, prove that you're insane, excuse me.
Yeah.
So just such a catch-22. And I guess the other question I have too is sometimes I don't know when I'm writing a story exactly why I need to write it. And I understand better after I've written it what the personal connection was for me. What's your personal connection, would you say, if you are willing to talk about it in diving into this issue? And you talked about politics. Clearly, our recent politics makes it all in the forefront of our minds. But on a more personal level, is there a reason that mental health issues and this subject called to you?
To be honest, not personally, but as I say, what I was personally fired up about was to write about the way women have been silenced through the claim we're crazy and the way mental health has been wielded. And I think the fact that I've written a non-fiction book from 1860, you've written a novel from 1920, and I've been able to cite, examples from just a week ago, just shows how prevalent this is. And that's really what got me fired up personally about it, was to try and expose that injustice, and to make people think about it. And that's what I hope people will do when they read The Woman They Could Not Silence. I hope it makes people think. A lot of readers have said to me it makes them angry. It's a book that makes them angry. And actually that's fantastic, right. Because just to pick up on the point I just made, women have been self-censoring in order to avoid the claim of being crazy, in order to get out of the asylums and get out of those cages. And the fact that people are responding personally with this rage, I think is really wonderful. And what I wanted to ask you, Mary, about, because in my book, what I was really fired up about as a writer was to immerse myself in the scenes of the asylum, which I sort of relate, in the present moment, as it were, because even though it's a history book, it's written almost as a novel, and you go on that journey with Elizabeth through the asylum. I was really struck that in your novel, Trinity is remembering it in flashback. And I wondered why you'd made that decision, that the asylum has happened, before your novel opens.
One of those questions, I think I started my original draft with a scene when she was actually leaving the asylum. And what I realized is that as I got further into her story, that her story really is about reclaiming her independence when she returns to live with her family on this island for a summer. And so it had to be in flashback, because otherwise I was setting up the reader for an expectation to be in the asylum experience the whole way through. And clearly mine is woven through the story, but not, you get bits of it as the story progresses, and maybe the harder bits as the story progresses. For me, I think I've just been two reasons. I write because I need a voice, and I grew up in a family with 10 kids, 7 brothers, very patriarchal family, and where, with a mother that still believed that really nursing or being a teacher were possible careers that were acceptable, but otherwise you should stay home and be a mother. Very limited ideas of what was okay. So, with everything I write, I'm always finding my voice and using it. And this story, I would say, is, strongest attempt at full emancipation in a way. And I just think, go
sorry
ahead.
to interrupt. Did you identify with Trinity in that? Because as you say, you know, Trinity is finding her way as an artist, as a painter. Did you pour yourself into her character with your, you know, journey of becoming a writer?
Oh, definitely. I think I definitely did. And, you know, every family has strains of mental health issues. And my family, in my adult years, I have siblings that have really have visited them in clinics and psych wards at times. So I have been much more aware of mental health and the how big that spectrum is. And I know that, like, my daughter would say, well, Mom, you're on the spectrum somewhere. You know, I know that I am abnormal enough to be able to live in my head and write novels and be alone a lot. But I also know that I can keep my feet on the ground. You know, I'm touched enough to be talented, but talented enough to be able to survive what that means. I think I'm rambling, but
You know,
I really, because of the family issues that I have, where I've been so close to mental health issues, and where I've had siblings that have really needed to go to the hospital, and we've been so frustrated when they couldn't get help until somebody was injured or they injured themselves. And that would be like such a frustration. And then when I could look at history and see that the pendulum has swung very far towards patient rights, which is fantastic, frustrating at times, but in lieu of where it had been, that women especially could be put away without any cause, and that whole umbrella of hysteria could cover things like postpartum depression and PMS as we think of it today, and any host of things. It just makes me really grateful that pendulum has swung, and you cannot be committed easily by somebody in your family that doesn't like you or disagrees with you the way you are. So yeah, I guess all of that makes me fairly, you know, feel like it's close to home, and I needed to explore it on many levels.
yeah. I mean, picking up on the hysteria thing, that was obviously a sweeping diagnosis in Elizabeth's time as well. And I was really struck by a line in your novel where you said, I made a note of it, who decides, for God's sake, who in a family or in a society has the right to decide what's normal? And that's really the sort of crux in a way of both our novels, I think, with what the characters are going through. You know, Elizabeth speaks out against her husband, insists, you know, simply by insisting on her right to her own opinion, and that is deemed insane. You know, Trinity pushing the boundaries, whether it's, you know, through being promiscuous or being artistic, you know, it's the same thing. She's locked up for trying to do something more. And I think what really struck me during my research was how many people were swept up by those diagnoses, who in Elizabeth's time was made generally by white middle-class Protestant doctors, who, you know, anyone who was different to them basically could end up in an asylum. If you were an immigrant, an ambitious woman, an effeminate man, you know, you would end up in the asylum. Can you talk about your research in the insane asylum? Because I was fascinated that you were able actually to go to St. Peter's. Could you actually go in the hospital?
Yes, they have a separate wing now that is actually set aside as the museum. And so they've replicated a number of the rooms. So it's not just like a patient's room. It's here's a restraining room, and here you can visually see some of the things that they had used at different times in their history. Yeah, the chemises that were actually straitjackets, you know, but called chemises. And so that was really great. There's something for me about going, yes, I do a lot of reading, but having to, if I can be in a setting, I can start to create that fictitious world a little bit better. So having a museum with actual displays was really, really helpful. And how about for you? Did you ever get a chance to see the hospital, the insane asylum that Elizabeth was at, or is it gone?
I went, but it is gone, unfortunately. So there were still things remaining. So I was able to walk past, like she did, the stone gateposts that mark the border of the asylum grounds. They're still there, obviously crumbling stone, but they're twice the height of a woman. But yeah, the actual building in which Elizabeth was held was knocked down 30 years ago. So I wasn't able to go. So in terms of the description of the asylum, I'm reliant on various patients' accounts. The wonderful gift that the asylum published their own reports every 2 years that described, even the width of the corridors and the paintings on the walls and things like that. So that was a real gift for me to be able to bring it to life. But no, I deeply regretted that I wasn't actually able to walk the same corridors that Elizabeth had done.
Sure. Did that asylum, my sense is that had a more public friendly facade too, as did this asylum. It had, a very, very nice foyer and nicely appointed with nice furnishings. Same
exactly kind of right. I mean, you showed in your presentation the postcard from St. Peter's with the bucolic scene of the sheep and so on. It was exactly the same in Jacksonville, Illinois, where Elizabeth was held. And Elizabeth writes, that these trappings outside, the beautiful building, the sweeping farmland all around. And she said they're there to make a passerby think this place is a heaven instead of a hell.
Right. Right. So it's interesting similarities. I loved at the end of your book, Kate, when you mentioned about our most recently departed president from the White House. Do you want to share that a little bit of your epilogue, or leave it for the reader to find later?
Sure. No, I'm happy to mention it. I mean, it's I can if I can find it quickly, I can read it out. It's from the very last postscript of the book, and it begins, "Pray for her," he urged. "She is a very sick person." The woman in question stood before him, the only woman in a room of men. She pointed a finger. She spoke back, a woman who refused to be silenced. He suspected there was something wrong with her upstairs. How else to explain this unhinged meltdown in which she dared defy him? It could have been Elizabeth confronting McFarland in the fall of 1860. It was Nancy Pelosi versus Donald Trump in October 2019. Full circle. Everything keeps happening, and I just hope that people are aware of what's happening, and like Elizabeth and like Trinity, are inspired to be their own people and to fight back.
Thank you for reading that, because I really felt like that reminded me why your book is so perfect for our time, why I'm so compelled to write a story like Trinity's story, because it's still relevant. Women are still asked to be behaved in a certain way. There's so many restraints and constraints. And if you slip outside of it, you can fall short of all kinds of opportunities or things that should be your right.
Completely. I've actually been really shocked as I've been talking to people about what I've been writing about and describing this historical book that I'm writing. The amount of people that have said to me, either that happened to me, I met people who in the 1980s were sent away by abusive husbands to psychiatric units, or they say, oh yeah, that happened to a friend of mine, or that happened to our neighbor. And it's still going on, even though we think it's such a dated thing. I talk about the sort of public discourse of saying powerful women are crazy, but actually, even more worryingly, the act of, sending women away psychiatrically as a form of control is still happening today as well. And that's really quite chilling and haunting to think about.
So my hope is readers of your book, readers of my book it's a challenge to be as true to oneself as you can be. And that takes some courage at times. And it's an ongoing process for all of us.
Yeah, and I think courage is the key word. And that's certainly what I took away from your character, Trinity. Her courage simply shines out from every page. And as I say, I certainly saw parallels between her and Elizabeth Packard, these two women striving to stand up for themselves and to become themselves against all the forces of opposition.
Well said. Thank you.
Thank you both. Kate, we did have a question, and I guess we never made this clear. Someone was asking whether Elizabeth Packard was American or British. Do you want to
Yeah, she's American, born in Massachusetts, born and raised, lived there for 21 years of her married life, and then they moved west to Illinois ultimately. And that's where the drama of the story happens. It's once the family have moved west from Massachusetts, and the drama is happening in Illinois. But then Elizabeth actually ultimately becomes this political campaigner. This is part of her legacy of changing laws and making the world a better place. And she travels from coast to coast, essentially campaigning, lecturing, writing, trying to ensure that no other sister, as she puts it, no other sister in America will suffer as much as she has.
Thank goodness she did what she did. As long as we're on the subject of UK and America, is this a phenomenon that was also happening in Great Britain at this time?
Yes, it was, and some of my research crossed the Atlantic as well. I was researching some British things as well as some American things, and it was absolutely happening here too.
Do either of you have numbers? Like Mary, did you have any numbers for the institution down in St. Peter about how many people were incarcerated over the time period that it was open and accepting people who were deemed insane?
I wish I had those numbers, but I can't report them to the person who's asking the question. I'm sorry. I'm sure I've come across it, but no help there at the moment.
For how many years was that hospital open in St. Peter?
Oh, I want to say it started in the late 1800s, and it was open until at least there was a lot of reforms done around 1940, 1950. And I want to say, well, it's still operational. That's why I couldn't go tour the whole thing, because a lot of it still had people there.
And is it still a mental health institute, or is it a regular hospital for all disorders now?
It is I believe, a more dangerous psychiatric holding place, and they have a few other facilities, so it's not just one type of patient. So, but the building is still there, and yes, the museum is a part of what you can go see there, but you can't go and visit all of the campus.
And Kate, what are the years that the hospital where Elizabeth Packard was sent, what were the years that it was operational?
So it opened 1851, I believe, and it was operational all the way through into the 20th century. So they knocked it down 1984. It went through, towards the end of its life, it went through a couple of changes. It became a developmental centre, so it would help people with learning difficulties rather than becoming a mental institute as such, in terms of a mental health hospital. But yes, it ran for all those, nearly a century and a half, was going strong. And the numbers just kept getting bigger and bigger. And actually, when I went to the site, the main building, the old building in which Elizabeth had been held, was knocked down, but lots of the auxiliary buildings are still standing. Because you asked about numbers earlier. Well, even in Elizabeth's time, the wards were overcrowded. They were building new wings to try to accommodate, all these other women that they had to lock up. They built a new wing just for women that had space to commit 150 extra female patients. And the numbers just kept growing. So the site kept growing and growing, and all the other buildings are still there. It was just the old hospital, the central building, that had been knocked down.
Was this hospital always only for women, or did it eventually?
No, and actually, even in Elizabeth's time, it was mixed sex. But while Elizabeth was at the asylum, they built a wing that was just for women, because they had so much demand for applications for female patients, that the legislature approved a female wing an additional 6 years before they added one for men, because the demand for women was just so much higher.
And one of our viewers tonight says that the hospital in St. Peter is still just for mental health patients. So
yeah, thank you
for adding that. One of the questions I had in both novels was both Elizabeth and Trinity. These are women who are very socially connected. And yet when they were sent away, neither of them had support from any relatives. I mean, Elizabeth had her children, but they were not of age to do anything. But I would have thought someone who had so many friends and extended family members would have had someone who visited them, someone who supported them, or tried to talk to their family, or did something to help get them out. How did you handle that in your novel, Mary? You want to start?
Yes, I mean, I think that we still struggle with shame around mental health issues. It's not something people often are quick to talk about. So go back 100 years or more, and also during the time of eugenics, and people thinking that if you had somebody in your family who had issues with insanity or dementia, it reflected on your family genetics and your family line. And so I was stunned when I read that many families would put an obituary in the paper when they sent somebody off to an asylum, because it was just easier to say that they were done, they were gone now. And I don't think that the idea that you would go back and forth and visit was a very common thing. Also, oftentimes people were a long ways from home. They weren't necessarily close by. But I didn't get the sense that patients were regularly visited as the norm. And Kate certainly in her book didn't, her true story of Elizabeth Packard also really shows that visiting wasn't encouraged in any big way, because maybe people would know about what was really happening there. Maybe you could speak to that, Kate.
Yeah, exactly. And I think in my book as well, with the Dr. McFarland, who was running the Jacksonville State Hospital, you're right, Mary, he didn't encourage visits. He actually wanted the patients to be cut off from their former lives so that he could dominate them. The idea being that, as Elizabeth called it, it would be this subduing treatment, that he would become the Prospero to the women's Caliban. They would learn, as he wrote, to become elevated by his smile and to bow at his reproof. And he wanted no other influence that could damage that relationship and sort of halt that subduing of the women. So visits from family were frowned upon and discouraged. In Elizabeth's case, you're right, Pamela, her children supported her, but her father, her brothers took her husband's side initially, because they just believed him. When they said that Elizabeth had gone mad, they took her husband's word, and just went with it. She did actually have some friends in the neighborhood who did try to get her out. They wrote to the doctor saying this was wrong, but they were simply dismissed. And because of the legal situation at the time, women and Elizabeth, were not seen almost as individuals. They were literally, by law, their husband's property. He could do what he wanted with them. And so even though people in the community appealed and said she's a sane woman, that had no bearing at all. The doctor and the husband thought they knew better, and therefore those appeals fell on deaf ears.
Fascinating. Last month, we hosted Chris Bojalian with his new book, The Hour of the Witch. And it's interesting to see these parallels, because it takes place about 200 years before your books. And in those days, when a woman was inconvenient or too outspoken or too powerful, she was labeled a witch, and of course had to deal with being thrown in jail or somehow removed from society there. Here we're seeing just another form. And as you said, Britney Spears today having, her father being the conservator for all of her rights as a young woman. It's still going on. It's amazing how little has changed in some cases. So. Any other questions from the audience tonight? Well, I am so thrilled that we've had both Kate Moore and Mary Casanova on the program this evening. I have put links to all the books in the chat box, and I'm posting them there again. As I said, you can order them online this evening at either Excelsior Bay Books or Valley Bookseller. You can walk into the stores tomorrow. There's book plates there, and whether you order your book online, by phone, or in person, you will get a book plate with your copy of The Woman They Could Not Silence and Waterfall. Don't forget, if you are in a book club, what a fascinating conversation your club can have by reading either or both of these books and talking about them the way we did this evening. The program will be recorded, so if you have a book club you want to share it with, you can certainly send that link along. I want to thank you all for coming tonight. All of us at Valley Bookseller and Excelsior Bay can't do the work that we do without your support and shopping local. We appreciate it so much. Mary and Kate, thank you so generously for sharing your time. And I'm sure Kate is more than ready for bed. And we want to tell you to please come back and join us again on July 21st for the Literature Lovers program, when we are going to have several authors. Florence Adler, Swims Forever. by Rachel Beanland is now available in paperback. It was an Indie Next pick, as you can see, and great fun for conversation and book clubs. She will be appearing. Call Baby by Morgan Jerkins. It's her debut novel. She will be joining us. And then we have a joint venture from Marie Benedict, who wrote The Other Einstein, and Victoria Christopher Murray, The Personal Librarian, about Carnegie's own personal librarian and some of the secrets that she carried with her. So I'm sure it's going to be another wonderful event. Again, it's free. Just go to the Literature Lovers site and you can register for that event. And again, it will be recorded if for some reason you're not able to watch it live. But please let me say thank you again to Kate Moore, the woman they could not silence, and Mary Casanova, Waterfall. I've also provided links for Mary's 2 other books that take place up at Rainy Lake, Frozen and Ice Out, that she mentioned in her slideshow, and Radium Girls, which was Kate Moore's earlier book. Absolutely fascinating. I know my book club had a fabulous time discussing it. And thank you all very much for joining us this evening. Hope you enjoy the rest of your summer and have plenty of time to read. Thank you. Good night. We'll see you again on July 21st.
Thank you.
Kate,
Thanks
you,
so
Mary.
much. Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.